morning. On behalf of the USJI, US-Japan Research Institute, I'd like to welcome to this seminar on Sino-Japan dynamics and implications for the US-Japan alliance. I'm the chair of the USJI, US-Japan Research Institute, and Executive Vice President of the University of Tokyo, Masako Egawa. USJI, or US-Japan Research Institute, is a research consortium operated jointly by 8 leading Japanese universities. We have 3 missions. One is policy analysis based on academic research, 2, human resources development, and 3, community building, all for the purpose of solving issues between the United States and Japan. This seminar today is part of the USJI Week, which is a series of seminars and workshops organized twice a year in February and September. And this seminar is actually the 10th event of this week. We are very grateful to our co-host, National Bureau of Asian Research. This is the second time we are cooperated to organize a seminar jointly. Just 2 weeks ago in Tokyo on February 13, we organized a seminar titled Adapting to a New Energy Era, Strengthening US-Japan Ties, and featuring Admiral Dennis Blair of US Navy and Honorable Taro Kono, a member of the House of Representatives of Japan. Today's topic is China in the context of US-Japan relations. This is very timely. Just this past weekend, Financial Times ran a feature titled US versus China, is this the new Cold War? So I'm very pleased we have been able to assemble such a distinguished panel of speakers who can address this important issue. So I'm very grateful for the speakers who came to participate in today's seminar, and I hope all of you will enjoy and actively participate in this important event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Igawa-sensei. My name is Abe Denmark. I'm Vice President for Political and Security Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research. We're a nonprofit research institution based in Seattle, Washington, with an office in Washington, D.C., focused on informing and shaping American policy and strategy in the Asia-Pacific region. I'm very thankful to USJI for cooperating with us and working with us on this important event. We're very happy to have worked with you in Tokyo and again just 2 weeks later here in Washington. I'm also very thankful to our panel that has been so kind in joining us today. Professor Lampton, the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Professor Kubo, the Director at the US-Japan Research Institute, and a Professor at the University of Tokyo, and Ambassador Richard Armitage, President of Armitage International and former Deputy Secretary of State. Since I'm going to be moderating today's panel, and since we put together such an illustrious group, my job is to get out of the way as much as possible. So in that spirit, I'm going to turn things over first to Professor Lampton.
Well, thank you very much, Abe, and thank you, Dr. Egawa, for convening this opportunity for us to talk about this important set of issues. I guess I want to, first of all, emphasize what I have to say are my own personal views, not attached to any other organization with which I'm affiliated. But I've been asked to talk about China's objectives, and particularly vis-a-vis Japan in its foreign policy and what strategy, if any, that China has in the recent problems we're all familiar with. I want to start with what I consider to be 3 basic thoughts about the US, China, Japan triangle. First, in my view, there will be no peace in Asia unless there are at least productive and hopefully harmonious relations among China, Japan, and the United States. So we really should conceive of this as how do we manage that triangular relationship. If we leave one man odd out, so to speak, we're going to have problems. So I think about it in that holistic sense. Secondly, I start from the premise that both our friends and our competitors can cause the United States difficulty. The capacity to run contrary to American interest does not simply reside with our competitors or countries with which we have strained relations in some dimensions. Our friends can also cause us difficulty. So we have to manage our friends as well as others. Another premise I start with is that we shouldn't frame this problem, particularly in the East China Sea, or for that matter, the South China Sea, certainly not at this point as one of China's aggression, which I don't think is the common definition, but is certainly out there as a thought. I think what's going on in Asia is what I would call competing nationalisms. We have the nationalism of Japan. We certainly have the nationalism of China. We have the nationalism of South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam. And so the real management problem is how we manage all of this nationalism in a way that allows economic and political and strategic stability. So those are what I take to be sort of the background basics of the problem here. Now, I've been asked to talk about Chinese goals and strategies, and I'll do so. First of all, though we speak in the language of China as a monolith, or that it has a set of goals, in fact, everything we're learning about China suggests there's a multiplicity of goals, competing interest groups, competing bureaucracies. And so it's a little bit of an abstraction to talk about China's goals. On the other hand, you have to say at any given moment they're behaving in a certain way, and you try to relate that to some plausible set of objectives. But I don't start from the premise that China is a unilateral actor. That leads me to the view that we have to try to work with those elements of Chinese society that are more compatible with our objectives than others. I also start from the premise that there's actual debate going on in China about the East China Sea and the South China Sea and many other issues. The debate is very complicated. We can't see it fully, but certainly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs doesn't in all respects agree with all elements of the People's Liberation Army in all of its complexity. So I start from that premise. But stripping away all the complexity, I think China's probably pursuing about 4 or 5 goals, and different groups would emphasize them a little differently. And I'm not listing those goals in a particular order of what I conceive to be the Chinese priority. But certainly one Chinese objective is to increase the security buffer, particularly its maritime security buffer. And some people have talked in terms of island chains and sort of pushing back military forces. I frankly have never heard a Chinese actually, to my face, say they had the objective of going beyond a particular geographic point. But clearly, the more space between them and foreign military maritime forces they can create, the better from their point of view. And what they had to put up when they were weaker and had no naval capability or Air Force capability or standoff missile capability, what they had to put up 30 years ago, they don't think they have to put up with now. I'm reasonably sure that's a widely shared goal. Secondly, another goal is, of course, has in some sense not anything directly to do with foreign policy, and that is we are still undergoing a leadership transition in China, and more generally, China's Communist Party has to bolster its legitimacy. And certainly domestic politics, the domestic political position of Chinese politicians, whether it's the current leader or past leaders, does not suffer when they're tough on Japan. So that certainly plays into the domestic politics. I think there's a third set of objectives. There's a book by a professor up at MIT, Taylor Fravel. It's about strong, I think it's called Strong Nations, Secure Borders, something like that. His basic point is that when China sees its territorial claims being weakened by the others, it will take assertive action to stop and hopefully reverse that weakening claim they might have on territory. And we can talk in the discussion period, but I think Japan's action of so-called nationalization of the islands, in any case, the Noda administration's move in that regard, was perceived in Beijing as weakening their claim, and so they're pushing back and pushing back maybe even to strengthen their claim, as well as restore what you might think the status quo ante. So certainly I think that's an objective. A fourth objective, I think, is to, quite frankly, drive a wedge into the U.S. alliance system. Well, we'll just put it this way. Japan and South Korea relations have certain tensions. And I think certainly some of the complex actions that are going on in the region are creating tension between South Korea and Japan. And certainly I don't think China finds that contrary to its interests. It's a broader worry that China has about the alliance system, our five major alliances in the region. So I think there's that objective. If you had to sort of put this all in one big package, I think the Chinese see between our so-called pivot, rebalancing 2.0, whatever you want to call it, see what they might call a neo-containment strategy. And their objective is to break out of it. Now, in my own view, some of the actions China is taking are in fact encouraging people in the region to get under the U.S. security umbrella. So I'm not for a minute arguing everything China's doing serves its own interests, as I would understand it. I don't think in fact they are. But in any case, I think those are some of the reasons I would adduce. Let me just tick off what I think are three implications for U.S. policy, and we'll get on with the program. First of all, I think the U.S. ought to be trying to encourage both sides, in this case China and Japan, to develop better crisis management mechanisms. I mean, we just have too much hardware moving around close to each other, and something's bad is going to happen. And so we ought to try to minimize that and encourage both sides to do that. Secondly, I think we need to put, not only encourage, put pressure, use the vocabulary you wish, on China not to push further, but quite frankly, a lot of things Japan is saying recently are disturbing to the South Koreans and to many Americans. And I think much of the rhetoric in Japan is not helpful in almost any regard. And I think that gets me to my third recommendation. I think we need to, and by we, I guess I mean Japan. There is a dispute. That seems to be the one obvious thing here. So some way we've got to move this thing from non-recognition of dispute into the zone of talking about it. I think Deng Xiaoping and the Japanese administration in the 1970s had it about right. This is something our generation's not smart enough to resolve. Let's quit talking about sovereignty. Let's think about either ignoring the issue or joint cooperation and development, irrespective of the sovereignty. I think that it has to move in that direction. And the first step has to be acknowledging there is a problem here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Kubo.
Thank you very much. My name is Fumiaki Kubo, and I think when I was contacted by I already three panelists, American panelists also.
Sorry.
I was contacted the most at the latest, and since this seminar is co-hosted by USJI, I think the organizers felt that there must be someone affiliated with USJI, and they finally found me hiding at the Wilson Center. And China first, Japan second, it's interesting, and United States it's okay. But anyway, this is a great honor for me to be here with distinguished panelists. How to with China is really a difficult foreign policy challenge to Japan. While there is a large-scale economic interdependence between China and Japan, China is clearly becoming at least a potential threat to Japan. And now both countries are fighting over many issues, including territorial disputes over Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. Since the end of the Second World War, Japan now faces its first direct challenge to its territory and sovereignty, except the case of Takeshima Dokdo, which is seized by South Korea in the early 1950s. Japan's relations with China were not particularly bad in 1970s and 80s. Japan appreciated it very much that China did not demand reparations when we normalized the relations. Instead, Japan has provided large amount of aid, which, by the way, is still somehow continued in a small scale. Now, how has Abe administration dealt with China? Faced with this direct threat to the islands, Prime Minister Abe has been consistent in responding to it in a tough and fairly strong way. He strengthened the National Security Council. He increased the defense budget for 2 fiscal years in a row, which had been cut or just flat for many years. He also successfully enacted Japan's first government secrecy protection law, with which the Japanese government now can share more sensitive information with the US government. He made significant progress in relocating Stem Air Station in Okinawa, and he revised the National Defense Program outline. He is easing further the ban on weapon export. I think these are a very impressive set of achievements accomplished almost within a year. And in fact, in Japan, just to be a prime minister for more than a year is a great accomplishment, I have to admit. And how then does the US look at Japan? For a long time, the United States has criticized Japan's foreign and security policy as being too cautious, too timid, inward-looking, as unwilling to take measures to be a stronger and full alliance partner for the United States. In this context, I think the way the Abe administration has acted on this issue is different from that of many former prime ministers, except Nakasone or Koizumi. And here's one of my points. Japan under Prime Minister, although it might be a bit controversial, it is probably at the same time a rare chance for the US government to support in order to strengthen the alliance at this fundamental level. However, these days there are small changes observed in the US government's attitude to its alliance with Japan. In his first term, President Obama declared the rebalance to Asia, and Secretary of State Clinton delivered a strong and tough message to China, especially in July 2010 in Hanoi regarding the territorial disputes in South China Sea. By contrast, in his second term, for example, Ms. Susan Rice, the President's National Security Advisor, said in her speech entitled America's Future in Asia, delivered in November 2013, that when it comes to China, we seek to operationalize a new model of major power relations. In this phrase, it appeared that she accepted Chinese terms. The word operationalize sounds as if the United States does not have to or will not confront China in any way. Excuse me. And in this speech and question and answer session, she did not mention that Senkaku was under Japan's effective administrative control, nor did she refer to the US treaty obligation to defend the islands under Article 5. The speech made many foreign policy observers in Japan concerned and nervous because of its tone, the importance of the person that delivered the speech, and the importance of the title, America's Future in Asia. Of course, there are positive messages or actions too, such as the strong endorsement of Japan's effort to reinterpret the right to collective self-defense by two secretaries, Kerry and Hagel, in 2013, or two B-52 bombers that went into the air defense identification zone unilaterally declared by China in late 2013. But still, sometimes Japan wonders where Japan stands in the minds of Ms. Susan Rice or President Obama. Now, I just touch on briefly Senkaku issue. Over the issue of Senkaku Islands, we sometimes hear our American friends, not in government, but outside the government, say, don't test us over rocks. But no, it is not just, I would say, it is not just Japan, not just the United States, but both Japan and the United States are being tested now over this issue. And for its part, Japan must do everything necessary to defend its own territory, though it must act with caution so not provoke China unnecessarily. The United States needs to make it more than clear that it will defend Japanese territory. Jointly, probably US and Japan have to be more prepared for the so-called gray area between normalcy and outright war, but at the same time, it might be more important for the top leaders of both countries to build stronger trust. And I think on the Senkaku, I think Japan has been acting with caution, right, even when the Chinese military ship locked the weapon guiding radar onto the Japanese SDF, Self-Defense Forces ship. Japan just avoided, didn't reciprocate. But on the other hand, I recognize that the visit to Yasukuni by Prime Minister Abe was probably very provoking. I personally was against that. I had felt that that would make the appearance that Japan is more responsible for the tensions in East Asia. And I think I understood the concerns of US officials about increasing tensions between its allies, Japan and South Korea, given the unpredictable situation in North Korea and East and South China Sea. But my somewhat detached prediction is that in the near future, I think there are prime ministers of Japan that visit Yasukuni as well as those who don't. This is because there are spirits of about 2.2 million wounded since Meiji period, and there are a lot of descendants, family members, and relatives, as well as political and religious adherents of this special shrine. And naturally, there are politicians who like to represent these people under these sentiments. I understand that this was an embarrassment to the US officials, but still, my feeling is that it would have been slightly better in terms of alliance management if the sense of disappointment had been communicated in private. I will stop in a minute. This is my last comment. It is sometimes pointed out that Japan has never felt sorry for what it did before 1945. However, the way Japan has conducted and run its foreign and national security policy since 1945 should be a good testimony to how Japan has felt about what it did before. A pacifist-oriented foreign policy has been entrenched and ingrained in the Japanese people's psyche and institutions very deeply, perhaps too much to accept the logic of alliance with the United States from time to time. Even if Prime Minister Abe gets everything that he wants to get, Japan still retains Article 9 with some small revisions and retain an exclusively defense-oriented security policy. It is also important to pay attention to how Japan has dealt with territorial disputes with Russia and Korea. Japan has never try to change the status quo in a unilateral way or by force. It just consistently try to solve the problems through negotiations and diplomacy. What China does with regard to Senkaku and also in the South China Sea these days is trying to change the status quo by force, by intimidation, or by the threat of force. At issue here is whether to choose international order where all the disputes are expected to be solved by peaceful means, or an alternative international order that China dictates, where the use of force is allowed to solve territorial disputes. Japan firmly supports the former. And this is my last final point. When President Obama visits Japan in April, we would like to hear a really strong speech with substance based on principles. We'd like him to speak about the kind of international order he would like to maintain, probably working with its allies, including Japan, which has to be the order where unilateral action or threat of force is never allowed. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Secretary.
Well, thank you. Good morning, Dr. Lampton, Dr. Kubo. I'm delighted to be with you. The interesting thing about batting cleanup is you might prepare some remarks, but I feel compelled to respond to some of the remarks that preceded me, so I'll give you a mixture of both. First, a comment on the pivot, which I made before. The so-called pivot. The word is offensive. It was uttered initially by Mrs. Clinton when she tied it with a suggestion that we're finally back in Asia. And many of the out-of-work Republicans screamed foul and said we'd never left Asia, and much to Mrs. Clinton's credit, she never used it again and preferred the term rebalance and acknowledged that we've never left Asia. But the manner, and as a reflection of our strategic interest, more attention to both Northeast and Southeast Asia are certainly warranted. But we were so inarticulate and unartful in our presentation that we've put ourselves in an almost unbelievable position, and that is that friends in Europe and friends in the Middle East do not believe that we're not turning our back on them, and many in Asia have questioned whether we really are pivoting or rebalancing in Asia, which is a remarkably difficult situation to find ourselves in, but it's because I think of a poor articulation. And second, on the question of China and whether China, what sort of China can we see in the future? Well, I certainly don't have the answer to that. We've all got some suspicions. But here's the question I'd like to put before you. When we look at China and China's activities and her statements, is this a China which is a Westphalian nation state of the 17th century, which believes in the absolute sovereignty, or a Westphalian state of the 21st century, which most of us, Japan, certainly in the United States, are, where we are sovereign nations, but we voluntarily cede some of that sovereignty for the global good, or something referred to as the global common, whether it's in space or freedom of navigation or airways, etc. So sometimes China's actions lead me to the conclusion that she's still a 17th century Westphalian nation state. If only because our North Korean friends this morning fired 4 short-range missiles, probably to signal the start of our U.S.-South Korean exercises, military exercises. I think we need to enter Korea, the Republic of Korea, into this discussion, because as has been alluded, China is making a lot of, or attempting to make a lot of hay, driving a wedge between certainly Japan and China, and certainly the United States and the Republic of Korea. Now, it's not a state secret that right now the U.S.-Japan relationship is in semi-troubled waters. Waters which I haven't seen for some time, and it's also not a secret that the government of Japan and the Republic of Korean government are in rough waters as well. It's not a secret either that the latter, that is the Korean-Japan relationship, is starting to play itself out here domestically in the United States. Primarily because of the very well-organized Korean-American groups who are trying to bring this forward. And China is delighted with all of that. In a very real way, I'm quite sympathetic to Japan, because I think no matter what Japan did, China would not be satisfied. Korea, quite a different situation in my view. And regarding the Korean-Japan relationship, I know that both sides are tired of each other. They're tired of what they see as each other's whining about these issues. And frankly, many in the United States are tired of what we see as the whining on both sides as well. And it puts us, Americans, in a very awkward and uncomfortable position, and we don't want to be seen as publicly hectoring or trying to drive the two nations together, but I think we do want to eventually put ourselves privately in a position of being able to hopefully foster a somewhat better relationship. Now, you know, U.S. and Japan share many things, and apparently we now share tea parties. The United States certainly has one, and some of the statements which Dr. Lampton referred to in Japan are clearly indicative, at least the nation's tea party. Green tea party. And I agree with you. Some of these comments are totally unhelpful, and they don't add anything to the public discourse. I think we have to acknowledge there are other shoes about to drop. The Supreme Court decision in Seoul, upcoming, about forced labor will have implications for U.S.-Japan relations. China has recently agreed to hear court cases on forced labor there. And then to add to this mix, the United States comes along and we score our own goals. If you're familiar with the soccer term, we have several own goals. The first, Dr. Kubo referred to, the question of disappointed we might have been with the visit to the Yasukuni Shrine. Why do I say this is an own goal? I actually think that the comment is inappropriate, but it was translated inappropriately by the U.S. Embassy translation section in Tokyo, and the translation, instead of being disappointed, which is a fairly mild rebuke, if it's even a rebuke, was translated from something that comes much closer to being hopeless or giving up hope. It's quite a strong statement. So that's what I call scoring an own goal and kind of making it more difficult to get on with U.S.-Japan relations. We certainly are partially scoring an own goal on the whole question of inability, unwillingness, or Gnosticism about moving forward to try to get trade promotion authority. We're working very hard, very well, with 11 other nations trying to get a TPP. Singapore meeting recently held may not have been all that we wanted, but the game's not over. But if the United States, who started this process, can't get enough courage, and this administration can't get enough courage to move forward, approach the Congress and Trade Promotion Authority, then we're really doing ourselves a huge disservice. And the final own goal, I think Dr. Kubo referred to, it's this new model of great power relations. At Sunnyland, when President Obama and Xi Jinping met, I thought our president's response to President Xi's suggestion of a new model of great power relations was terrific. President Obama said, we don't do bumper stickers, we're not into sloganeering, it's content of the relationship, et cetera, that matters. But recently, we've kind of slidden off that and have seemed to have embraced the new model of great power relations. But when the Chinese say it, they always say we want to have a new model of great power relations and respect for core interests. When we say it, we say new model of great power relations and not the respect for core interests. Because just like China, we have core interest in the peaceful resolution of these questions. Territorial questions such as the Senkaku is a core interest of ours. And for that matter, the Spratlys and the Paracels, that they're peacefully resolved. How they're resolved, we're not so interested in, as long as it's peaceful. And finally, in the own goal category, we've been really giving mixed messages. And primarily, I think our military commanders have been speaking out of term, and no one here in the Washington bureaucracy thus far has seen fit to call them on it. And the difficulties we're having in the U.S.-Japan relationship has made our Japanese friends totally attuned to every signal and every nuance and every difference between Mr. Kerry's statements and Mr. Hagel's statements, and Mr. Biden's statements and Mr. Kerry's statements, and Dr. Rice's statements and anyone else. So what this really speaks in my mind is a lack of confidence that's starting to develop in some areas, in some sections of Japan. I don't think it's a lack of confidence on sort of high-level deterrence. I think our Japanese friends are quite confident that the United States, whether the nuclear umbrella and conventional support for attacks on the home islands and things of that nature is quite strong. It's the gray areas to which Dr. Kubo commented, where there are questions. And it is those gray areas. I don't know what better term to use for them. They're not peace, they're not war. They may not even be military. There might be extensions of fishery rights, which the Chinese recently announced from Hainan. These gray areas are where there is some lack of confidence. And these are exactly the areas where I think the United States and Japan ought to be quietly sitting down together, discussing, figuring out what's important, what's not, what these gray areas consist of, are they worth higher levels of effort by both of us, etc. Now, at the beginning of this administration, the mantra for U.S.-China relations was no surprises. Well, then China came up with some big surprises. ADIS, 9-dash line, fisheries from Hainan. So I think, at least regarding U.S.-China, the no surprises mantra is gone, but maybe we ought to introduce that into the U.S.-Japan relations, a no surprises mantra. Now, I was not, frankly, this might be controversial in some quarters, I was not totally surprised nor terribly alarmed about a Yasukuni visit by the Prime Minister for several reasons. First of all, he said, as a campaign promise, I'm going to do this. So for us to be shocked that an official would actually follow through on a campaign promise, maybe in the United States, that would be surprising. But I was not surprised. It was inconvenient for me because it's doing Chinese diplomacy for them. But I wasn't totally surprised, more so earlier this week I was asked to come to the Pentagon and take part in a 50th anniversary of, guess what, the Vietnam War. Just like Japan, a war we lost. Though the men who fought in it, and were men then, in both our wars, fought valiantly and well for their countries. Most countries celebrate these sacrifices even when they lose, and perhaps more so when they lose. So I was not particularly upset about that. I'm terribly distressed by the whole question of comfort women and things of that nature, because I think this speaks about how Japan sees herself in the world. I find Japan, and I see in Japan, that I want to have as a paragon of respect for human rights, human dignity, and I think in many parts of the world, we know Japan is the most respected country in the world. Of course, not so in Korea, not so in China for the historical reasons. But look at Southeast Asia, look at South Asia. The combination of the Abe administration diplomacy and the reputation for good behavior internationally, for being a good citizen internationally, has really raised the affection with which all those nations view Japan. And that's the biggest disappointment for me, in that I was one of those who was hoping that the Abe administration, the second Abe administration, as it were, would be one which raised Japan onto their place on the world stage as a prime example of the way nations should behave in the 21st century. Finally, for U.S.-Japan, the most important thing right now, I believe, is for, the first rule of holes. When you're in one, stop digging. We should stop digging. And we ought to use the opportunity of our President's upcoming visit to have quiet talks between us, initiated by Japan or the United States. They shouldn't look to the United States to initiate all these talks. To start talking about what's important to us and what kind of relationship we want to have together, say in 2025. How does Japan view itself on the world stage in 2025? What about us? Are we in decline? I don't believe so. I've never believed so. But I think it gives us an opportunity to reassess and list our attributes and do so with our Japanese friends. So it's most important, I think, right now, that we take a deep breath, slow down, sit together and figure out what's important to us.
Thank you very much. We're going to be transitioning to the Q&A phase of the session. I think there'll be a microphone roving around. All that we ask is that before you ask your question, you identify yourself and your institution. And we ask that all questions end in a question mark and not an exclamation. And we'll try to get as many people as we can before the end of the session. So I see a hand in the back.
Ken Meyer, World Docs. It's fashionable these days to compare in the centenary year of the outbreak of the First World War, to compare the rise of China to the rise of Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. I'm fearful that a different historical analogy is more apt, and that would be Great Britain's guarantee to Poland in the days before the outbreak of World War II. As I understand it, the status of the Senkakus was left rather unclear in our military agreement with Japan. So it seems like we could have told the Japanese, we don't take a position on the sovereignty of the Senkakus, you'll just have to work that out with the Chinese. Instead, we've given Japan an implicit guarantee, just as Great Britain gave the Poles a guarantee in their dispute with Germany over Danzig. So you could say that the World War II line, why die for Danzig, has been replaced with the line, why die for Daiyu? 60 million people died for Danzig, a lot more could die for Daiyu. Historians are still debating why the UK gave that guarantee to Poland. I'll preempt future historians and ask, why did we give that guarantee to Japan?
Okay, thank you. Very important question. First of all, history is important, but I think the analogy of the time before World War I and the current situation is not appropriate one, and I think Prime Minister's remark was probably quoted off as a point slightly, but I think it is not very smart for him to say that. About other guarantee that is given to Japan about Senkaku under Article 5 of US-Japan Security Treaty, I think, the implication of your question is that Japan will get even bolder to pursue effort. But probably, first of all, that's not probably correct. I think, Japan's effort has been and is trying to just defend its own territory, and we are not ready to go into other areas. We are just trying to defend our own house. And even that the current position taken by the United States is pretty new. When Ambassador Mondale was in Japan, I think he said that the Article 5 will not be applied to Senkaku, which is very disappointing to the Japanese official. And it was under George W. Bush administration that the U.S. official first started to say that that will be applied, Article 5 will be applied to Senkaku. And Hillary Clinton and I think Gates, two secretaries, said that in private, I think in 2010, when there was a first crash between Japan and China over Senkaku after Japan's arrest of a fisherman's boat captain. And interesting enough, Japan is a little bit, of course, dissatisfied with the U.S. position, kind of neutral on the sovereignty issue, but positive on the application of its treaty obligation. United States has a special relationship with Senkaku because it kind of ruled Okinawa, Ryukyu, including Senkaku from 1945 to 72, and it did kind of military exercises there, I understand, to which China didn't object. So, given this special history, I suppose there might be a kind of a change in U.S. attitude, and I found recently that Senator McCain and Marco Rubio said, I think in the case of the Senator Rubio, he said that in the interview with NHK, that they are critical of Obama administration's attitude, and Marco Rubio explicitly said that the U.S. government should change the current attitude and recognize that the island actually belongs to Japan in terms of sovereignty. So I'm not sure this kind of attitude will be shared too much, to what extent. But since Marco Rubio is regarded as one of the presidential candidates, it might be shared by many other important influential politicians. But I'm just guessing. Thank you.
Just on that, on 2 points germane to this. I think at the current time, China takes U.S., we'll call it deterrence, is credible on this issue. I mean, I think most Chinese, I've not met a Chinese that doesn't understand the historic relationship between Japan and the United States, and that in our own politics, it would be almost impossible to ignore use of coercion. So I think at the moment, that's not the problem. If I understood Professor Kubo, for the U.S. to actually get rid of, at this point, this ambiguity, we don't recognize the sovereignty, but we do recognize our commitment under the alliance, I'll agree that's got its internal tensions and contradictions at one level, but I could hardly think of anything more explosive in Chinese politics than to resolve that ambiguity that way. So, I mean, I think that would just, that would be throwing a match into a gas-filled room.
If I could ask you to expand on how you think, what your expectations would be from the Chinese reaction to an American movement.
I'm not going to predict it, but it would be undesirable from almost everybody's point of view. I think even China's long-term interests. I think China would find it hard to help itself.
I don't want to prolong the agony on this, but your question. History is very interesting to study, but history is formed by people who are making day-to-day decisions. And in 1972, we were prepared to make it very clear about sovereignty. But the protestations of not only the People's Republic of China, but the Republic of China, who was very big in our body politic and loomed large in our frontal lobes of our mind, were so against it that we decided it was too hard to do. And we reverted in 1972, Okinawa, and we were no longer a military administration, and it became under the of Japan. So in retrospect, would it have been more convenient to do something else? Probably. But the difficulty is history is made by people making decisions at the time and trying to do the best job they can at that time.
Do you, just to follow up, do you agree though that actually resolving this ambiguity in favor of the sovereignty claim of Japan would be not wise?
It depends on how this is resolved. If it were resolved in some sort of international criminal court or something, that's entirely different. If you're suggesting that the United States right now change our position, no, I don't think that's appropriate.
Thank you all very much. All right, yes.
Hi, Nadia Chao with the Liberty Times from Taiwan. President Ma from Taiwan recently proposed like a code of conduct in the East Sea. I wonder, do you have any comment? I understand this might be more even difficult than the code of conduct in the South China Sea, but is that a possible solution? And for Professor Kubo, have you ever heard any debate in Japan actually, encouraging Japan to accept that there's a dispute in the Senkaku Island? I know it's hard for any politician in Japan to do that, but is there any voices you have ever heard from the academia or from any party that this might be a solution? Thank you.
I couldn't hear. What was the solution?
I mean, have you ever heard any parties or any academic group in Japan actually encourage the Japanese government to accept this is as a dispute. You know, there's a dispute in the Senkaku Island. Thank you.
I'll take the first part. If I may, Madam, I'll take the first part of the question. My and Joe's suggestion of code of conduct is perhaps the only real attempt at diplomacy. It's the only thing out there, and as such, it deserves a good look, and particularly because the way Taiwan has recently resolved two difficult issues. One, the fisheries agreement with Japan, and second, the death of Taiwanese fishermen at the hands of some of the Filipinos Coast Guard, as I recall. Both those issues were resolved peacefully, and having had this conversation with President Ma and Joe, I know he was hopeful that this would be a sign or signpost for other countries in the region to see the way that you can resolve difficult issues peacefully.
I think these two parts are actually intertwined, and it would be wonderful to have a very strict code of conduct anywhere. For example, in South China Sea, we need that definitely, not for the interest of Japan, but for the Philippines or for Vietnam, and that would be also very nice in East China Sea, and that should be reinforced by a kind of mandatory mechanism. Which means that you do not change the status quo by force or by intimidation of force, which is essential for the international stability. But that doesn't mean that Japan recognizes that there is a dispute, territorial issue over Senkaku, and probably our government will not recognize that. Sorry for interrupting. And but in Japan, we are a very democratic society. People are kind of discussing this very heated way, and there are people who say that we should at least recognize that there is a diplomatic problem with these islands, and that they say that would be a first step to better relation with China. But I think at the policy decision-making level, I think these voices are pretty minority. And but personally, don't agree with that, because that might be just the first step for China to have a more aggressive agenda, and they have a continental shelf theory, and sometimes they say that even Okinawa are theirs. So we are not sure that that would be their kind of final goal. So I think there are arguments in Japan.
Just to follow up on the fisheries agreement and Ma and so forth, that seems to me in the vein of what I was suggesting and what had been done with Dunn and the Japanese administration in the 1970s, which is to effectively say we've got a territorial or sovereignty dispute here, but we can find practical areas of mutual benefit for cooperation. And that seems to me, I would hope both the Japanese and the PRC could learn from Mr. Ma Ying-jeou's recent behavior.
I agree. No, I think our relation with Taiwan is a kind of a witness to we could have a very peaceful, stable relationship, even having a territorial dispute at the same time.
We'll try and move on to the left side, in the middle there.
Hi. Before, Dylan Ryan, George Mason University. Before the shift to the east, the U.S. was in a sort of a debacle in Iraq. And I was wondering what the lessons from the Iraq War are. And this is particularly for Mr. Armitage, who was a contributor to the Project for a New American Century, which advocated invading Iraq even before 9/11. So I was wondering, what could we learn from our problems in the Middle East, and what do we learn from that when we focus on Asia? Thank you.
I'll answer your question. Of course, this is a U.S.-Japan-China meeting, but I think the lessons for Iraq are quite obvious. One, if you're going to commit military force, that you need to do it in an overwhelming way, which we didn't do. One, that when you do commit military force, you can unleash forces which you didn't fully understand or didn't fully expect, which certainly happened in Iraq. Two, that Secretary Powell, or three rather, as Secretary Powell had indicated to our president, if you break it, you own it. And it's going to be very difficult to extricate yourself from this. And I think there are a whole subset from that. The letter to which you refer was written at a time when, first of all, the Clinton administration's policy was for regime change in Iraq, and second, that as far as I know, everyone who signed that letter believed firmly that we were facing a nation with weapons of mass destruction. That turned out not to be the case, and therefore, and my view is, had that been known to President Bush and his colleagues, there would have been no attack on Iraq, had it been known beforehand.
Yes, sir. On the aisle there. Microphone comes? It's coming.
You can yell.
Thank you, Mike Pacetic, PBS Online NewsHour. Mr. Secretary, your comments about military commanders making statements, did you include in that, under that cover, the recent speech by the head of intelligence of the Pacific Command suggesting that the Chinese were preparing for a short and decisive war in the islands, and whether you agree with whether he should have made that in a public speech? Do you agree or disagree with the substance of his remarks?
Actually, I was speaking about military officers of much higher rank than a colonel. But the specific question is, I don't think he should have made those remarks. I don't think that's U.S. government policy, and that's not, as I understand it, the view of the intelligence community, which has a more nuanced view of what been going on. But you could certainly include it in the litany of complaints I had about some questions of off messaging by some senior military leaders.
There's a question in the back there on the left side.
Thank you for doing this. My name is Jun Kamichikawa. I'm with Kyodo News. I would like to ask a question about Prime Minister Abe's visit to Yasukuni Shrine. I remember the U.S. Embassy in Japan showed disappointment because it will exacerbate the tensions with neighbors. But it's unclear of the U.S. view on the visit itself, probably on purpose. As Chinese are claiming, the visit itself is a kind of sort of a challenge to the result of the Tokyo Tribunal. So do you think Japanese Prime Minister can visit Yasukuni without U.S. disappointment if Japan can find a way to visit there without raising tensions? Thank you.
As I indicated earlier, I think this is a rather complicated question. Mr. Nakasone, Mr. Hashimoto, Mr. Kozumi 3 times went to Yasukuni, to my knowledge, and never was a word uttered. So at a point in time, this was not a matter of high importance, and to a large extent was seen much more as a religious matter than a political matter. Given the visit, the rather large-scale visit by many Diet members at one time, a year or so prior to Prime Minister Abe's visit, the context of the visit took a much more political flavor than it would have otherwise. And as I said, my personal view is I'm not very happy or unhappy with Yasukuni. This is a matter of Japanese leadership deciding what's best for the entire nation. However, I'm not immune to the fact that this did China's diplomacy for them. I'm sure in Beijing they were delighted when the Prime Minister went to Yasukuni, because all they had to do then was call on the telephone to their various foreign ministry counterparts and say, see, I told you. So that's my objection to this visit. Not the visit per se, but the fact that it was playing into a narrative that our Chinese friends were spreading throughout the region, that this is a Japan that doesn't accept the Cairo Declaration, the Potsdam Declaration, et cetera, et cetera. So,
I was going to say, just at the end of your question, you raised the issue of, is this a challenge to the outcome of World War II in the sense of the war crimes trials and so forth. I don't think you have to look to the Yasukuni Shrine to find some statements that are worrisome from an American perspective. Recent statements by at least one member of the NHK board basically said the war crimes trial were a smokescreen for American war crimes. So,
just for the record, and you're right, American soldiers during World War II were executed by our government for war crimes.
Yeah, I think the bottom line, the core, the most important thing is that about Yasukuni is that, or why it became a political international issue, is that it's because there are spirits of Class A war criminals, kind of combined arresting at the shrine, and I think that's the fundamental issue. And I think since it was revealed that these spirits were kind of arresting there in 1979, and before that, the Prime Minister and Emperor, even Emperor visited that shrine without inviting any international criticism. And in 1985, for the first time, China started to criticize that. And so in that sense, that they decided that they must get angry over this. And looking back, I have to admit that how effective their campaign was, because this has kind of institutionalized as a kind of established international issue. And there are a heated discussion within Japan how to get rid of these spirits of Class A war criminals. But once they become God, I don't know how we can demote them from God. And there's a lot of misunderstanding by the international media. New York Times once wrote that there's a tomb or graveyard at the Yasukuni Shrine of the Class A criminals, which is not true. There's no grave. And just a day or two ago, I saw a Singaporean Straits Times which said that Class A criminals are buried there, which is not true. It's just spirits. You can't see them unless you are really, really religious. And I cannot see spirits. And so, we are wondering how we could get rid of these spirits. And the priest, head of the priest said, no way. But if there is another head of the priest, there might be another policy to deal with that. And one proposal proposed by one government panel was to establish a new national non-religious institution. But some people say that the spirits will not move from Yasukuni to this new institution, and there are some affection, attachment of the families to this particular institution. So people still, keep visiting this shrine. And there's another proposal proposed by some influential politicians, which is to nationalize the shrine and get rid of these spirits. But we have in pre-war time, the Yasukuni was part of the government. Government can order. But now Yasukuni Shrine has independent religious status, and we have a separation of church and state clause. It's very effective. I'm not sure we can overcome a kind of this constitutional barrier in trying to nationalize this shrine. But at the end of the day, this is I wonder that this is a great question. Even if Japan can successfully get rid of these Class A criminals, and we can take back the condition before 1978, then Prime Minister will visit the Yasukuni Shrine, and even the Emperor might visit the shrine again. Then China and Korea accept our the visit. I think we shouldn't be very optimistic.
If I may, my view is that China doesn't care that much. This is a vehicle for China. I think for the Republic of Korea, the visit to Yasukuni is not the main issue. It is comfort women. And I cannot speak, obviously, for the Republic of Korea, but I just know in discussions with officials, this is the issue. So I think, like everything surrounding Yasukuni, you have to parse these questions very carefully. From a Japanese point of view, the term Class A war criminals, 14 of them, whose spirits are at Yasukuni, well, they were tried for crimes against peace, not for crimes against humanity, crimes against peace. No one knows what it is. There's no statute. The B and C war criminals, and there are, like our own war criminals who are tried or convicted and subject to some jurisprudence and had a penalty meted out, just as the U.S. soldiers, as I referred to earlier, did when they committed war crimes in the Second World War.
Yes, on the aisle there.
Leah Liu from Voice of America. Professor Kubo, if I understood him correctly, suggested that China is trying to change the status quo both in East China Sea and South China Sea. I'm curious to see what Secretary Armitage and Professor Lambton had to say about that. Of course, you know, Chinese are arguing just the opposite. They are responding to the actions taken by the other parties. If I may, I also want to ask Secretary Armitage what you think about Secretary Hagel's announced plan to reduce troops, American troops, and what this would do, whether it's going to reduce American capabilities in maintaining the current international order in which the United States plays a central role.
You want to start first?
Yeah, I don't agree with you, obviously. As I said, what is happening around the Senkaku Islands area is the Chinese semi-military ship or Coast Guard ship entering territorial water almost every week. Last year, a couple of times, the Chinese fighter entered territorial airspace, which was very dangerous. So in that way, China is trying to undermine sovereignty by force or by the use of force. Also, the Territorial Waters Act of 1992 was kind of a very dangerous unilateral action done by China. By one stroke of legislation, it declared that all these islands are China's. Probably you like to talk about so-called nationalization of the Senkaku, but you know, the island had been under Japanese government effective administrative control for many years, since 1895, except the period which is when it was ruled by the U.S. But since 1972, it has been under Japanese administrative rule, and the Japanese government had a kind of rental agreement with the landowner, and it had ruled the island. So you know, there's no change in the status quo. You know, Japanese government owned it like with the left-hand side, and you know, now we change that with the right-hand side. You know, I think basically that change is that level.
On the question of the budget and the level of soldiers, first of all, this is a proposal. And go to the U.S. Congress, and what comes out is not always bearing a great deal of closest resemblance to what went in. So as a beginning of a proposal, that's the way you should look at this. Second, to use the terminology of lower troop levels before World War II is not the right measure, in my view. During World War II, a premium was placed on having soldiers with rifles. And we didn't have the automation, we didn't have all of the modern warfighting equipment and tools that we have now, so it's clear that we don't need the same number of people carrying rifles. Having said that, it is clear at the end of the day that only an infantryman with a bayonet can bend an enemy to our will, and only a soldier with a rifle can take and hold ground. And this is immutable, I think, in military history, and will remain so into the future. The fact that when Secretary Hagel gave his proposal, unveiled his proposal, the service secretaries and the chiefs of the services who have the responsibility for the equipping of their men, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who has the overall warfighting responsibility, they were in attendance and in agreement. It gives me some sense of confidence that Mr. Hagel is doing the best he can with what he's got.
Well, I agree with Secretary Armitage and all of that. I think the first part of your question was, is China trying to change the status quo, was the part of the question I heard. And I think at one respect, if they thought they could restore the status quo of Deng and the Japanese administration in the 70s, they would do it. I think, however, they're realists and they don't believe, well, that the Japanese government is so dug into its position that that's going to happen. So I think their, call it fallback or current position is, we must every day, every hour challenge the validity of Japanese administration of those waters and airspace. And they've adopted a strategy of making their disagreement clear to the international community, because they believe acquiescence equals agreement under international law if it goes on long enough. And that gets to my recommendation. Therefore, you've got an awful lot of equipment flying and sailing in close proximity to each other, and this is a big problem. And I don't think China's gonna, I hesitate to predict Chinese behavior, but I don't expect to see them change that strategy until something else changes to make it plausible for them to do it.
To add one thing, the unmanned, so-called unmanned aircraft entering our territorial space, that's very dangerous. Of course, Japan's self-defense force will tell them to leave, but tell whom? Some unmanned aircraft, and if they stay, there's no way other than to shoot them down. But the Chinese government say that they will regard that as an act of war. So what happens? It's very dangerous.
Yes, in the middle.
Gil Rosman, formerly of Princeton, now at the ASEAN Forum. My question is for Professor Kubo, and that is, after Secretary Armitage brought South Korea into the picture, I wonder if you would elaborate on what Japan is doing to strengthen ties with South Korea in order to face the China challenge. Some argue that Japan seems to regard South Korea as hopeless and to be under a honeymoon illusion with China, whereas the U.S. is very eager to get more cooperation among these countries. Do you have some thoughts about what Japan can do to draw South Korea closer?
Thank you very much. I don't think I have a very good idea. I think Japan has done many things, but they hadn't worked. Kono's statement was the first step, and we established a so-called Asia Women's Fund, which is not very bad. That was a fund whose money came from government as well as from private donations, and it paid compensation for women, and it worked with several countries, but it didn't work in the case of Korea, unfortunately. I don't know why, but sometimes it is pointed out that the money was not purely coming from government, but that's kind of one perspective. But standing, looking at from a different perspective, that fund might be even better because the money also came from the private donations because many Japanese felt sorry about what happened. So, and we heard the Prime Minister Murayama's statement in 1995, which is actually earlier than the Asia Women's Fund. And some say that that statement is just a personal statement, which is not true. That was a cabinet-approved statement. And the cabinet is the highest organ in the Japanese the executive branch, different from United States. U.S. Constitution doesn't have a word cabinet, I guess. President can decide everything in the executive branch. So that was a very kind of important, serious decision, which was kind of succeeded by every cabinet, basically. And at the end of another administration, which was 2012, one aide for the Prime Minister visited the Korean president and proposed a kind of a solution, the apology, compensation. I think that was almost 100% answer to what Koreans wanted, but I think that was somehow turned down. So and probably you understand that there is a political limit to one country can do, to express a sense of sorrow or apology. And if you ask the Japanese emperor to get down on hands and knees and apology, that will not happen. So within this the political limit, I think Japan's record was not perfect, but we did several things, and also first of all, every wartime issue was supposed to solve by 1965 the agreement, and after that, in concluding that agreement, Japan paid fairly a lot, just a little bit smaller than the national budget of the Korean government at that time, and after that, Japan also kept giving financial assistance also, as well as technical assistance. So, probably we can, tell a little bit different story about the relationship between Japan and Korea. And of course, we like to cooperate with Korea, especially in the case of some emergencies or contingencies in the North Korea. And also, we like to have a kind of united front against China on certain areas. And especially the Japanese government, SDF, Self-Defense Force, is ready to have a more working relationship, like sharing the sensitive information. But as a matter of fact, the Korean government refused to do that.
Other questions? Professor Orris.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Andrew Orris from the Washington College and the East-West Center in Washington. So far, our discussion has been very sort of bilaterally oriented, and I wonder if the panel would agree in response to this question that I want to pose, is do you think that we should see the Senkaku Diaoyu issue as primarily a Japan-China issue that has broader implications for others like the US? Or rather, do you think that we should see it more as a symptom of a changing regional and international order that is being caused largely by the re-emergence of China in the international system? And I guess what I sort of mean by this, to just elaborate a bit, is it seems that the idea of restoring the status quo, as we've been talking a lot about, it seems to sort of assume that the regional system also would restore to a status quo. But actually, Chinese military spending has gone up about 10 times in the last couple of decades. Japan is a much weaker actor in the economic sphere as well. There's a diffusion of power. So I just wonder how you see this, more bilaterally or more as a symptom of a change in the regional and global system.
Take a first step.
Go ahead.
Okay. A lot of questions there. Well, I certainly, there has its bilateral dimensions, and your question applies. We've been talking about that, so we'll just stipulate that. I think it does have systemic implications, and it speaks to first of all, speaks to the whole system of bilateral alliances in Asia, the 5 U.S. alliances, and are they themselves adequate to manage peace with a growing China and a more nationalistic Asia, as I mentioned? So I think it raises questions about, not in the immediate future, but how can we move from a security system in Asia in which China, because of the Cold War, sort of feels outside that structure, to some set of institutions developed over time in which China has ownership and participation. So I think it raises that. It certainly raises the issue of how China, I mean, quite frankly, I think Chinese believe that a strong and weak China wasn't in the position to protect its interests, and as it gets stronger, it's in a better position to do so. And China's going to go on an agenda of issues that it's had dissatisfaction with for probably 150 years in some sense. I don't think that's an unlimited agenda, but I think there is an agenda there. And so we're going to have to find ways to accommodate in some cases and manage in others China's greater power. And I think it raises the issue of whether the existing institutions in the Pacific are, I'm not saying they're totally inadequate, but it seems quite evident they're not totally adequate.
Dr. Warros, thank you. I was tempted to, I wrote myself a note. The answer to your 2 questions is yes. It is, of course, obvious in the bilateral nature of this, but it has implications. Chinese behavior there has implications. For instance, a couple of days ago, we had what some allege was another incursion into India, into disputed territory, and I won't even mention parasols and Spratly. So I look at this, it's bilateral, the Senkaku issue, but it has sort of tendons and tentacles out there and several other relationships. I think, Doctor, your response about the adequacy of the present structure in Asia is dead on. You're right, it's probably not adequate, but until we figure out what is, you shouldn't give it up. You should hold on to it. I have, for instance, the code of conduct, which ASEAN is talking about, is a step in the right direction if China would be serious about it, which they haven't chosen to be yet. But I think that's the question about the adequacy of our present structure, which has served us so well since 1945, if it's adequate to the re-rise of China on the world stage, which I think most of us feel might be the most important thing that happens in the first half of the century.
I think your question has a very good point, and what is at stake over Senkaku has grave and very serious, very important implications for everyone on this planet. As I said at the conclusion of my presentation, what is at stake is whether you like to keep the current international order where the status quo change is not allowed by force, or you like to see a different international order where the status quo could be changed by force and it is allowed. And I guess people living far apart from the Senkaku area might be indifferent to the small dispute over small islands, but it has a very important, grave implications for about what kind of international order we like to have, we like to keep.
I promised the participants that we would end on time, so we have time for one last question. I'll use that to give them an opportunity to answer the question, but also make any closing statements that they have. So you, sir.
Thank you. I'm Donald Romberger. I work for the Defense Department, but my question has nothing
Should
to
wait
do
for a
with
microphone to make sure the folks on TV can hear you.
I'm Donald Romberger. I'm from the Defense Department. But my question has to do with what you've been talking about for the last 5-10 minutes. Why is China so adamant about doing it bilaterally as opposed to multilaterally? China seems to be wanting to deal with each one of those nations separately and has refused to go into a multinational, multilateral posture.
I think the short answer is because, like some say, size matters. And when they go bilaterally, they have an advantage. And when we try to ensnare them from their point of view in a multilateral scenario, they do not have the same advantage. And that would be my answer to your question, sir.
My answer is because China will be isolated when, as many people as, they are get together. I think their position is unique in the sense that they can do, they think that they can change the status quo by force.
All I would add is, of course, China's more willing to be multilateral in economic areas than security areas. So I think there's a little nuance there.
So unless there's some closing statements from anyone on the panel, I think we can close things up. Please join me in thanking you. Thank you.